Good afternoon, Frank.
Good afternoon, Professor.
Well, there's a lot happening, and it's difficult to know exactly how to bring it all together in a 15-minute talk about the relationship to globalization. But what has come to my mind more than anything else in the last few days is the fact that the proportion of the world's population that is moving into cities is continuing to grow at an increasing rate. And that got a lot of attention a few years ago when it crossed the 50% mark. But recently it's not been mentioned much. But I think that actually it's behind a lot of the things that have been amazing people in the last few months. I remember that in the statistics that came out after the Brexit vote, it was made very clear that the cities had voted to stay, and it was the people outside the cities that had voted to leave. And if the same proportion of people in the cities had voted as the people outside the cities, then the city vote would have carried, and it would have been a vote to remain. Now, as far as I know, we don't have similar statistics in the US for the people voting for Trump, for example. But it would be interesting to know whether there is a difference between urban voters and non-urban voters in the primaries and the lead up to the conventions.
I don't know that I've ever seen any breakdown in the primaries versus urban and rural. I think you're correct. But certainly, I think you can extrapolate some of the polling data if you tie education level with potential residency locations. You can begin to walk it back that way. But of course, it won't be until actually after the election itself.
Yeah.
But we will have a laser-like focus, precinct by precinct, of just what you're talking about.
Yeah, but one would have thought actually that since the primaries are held in cities, that most of the voters in the primaries would be urban. So it may be different in this country. But the other thing is that there are a lot of people who moved into cities who are not yet used to urban life and are in fact voting against the things in the cities that are different from what they were used to outside the cities. So it's another part of this problem of going through this, what I've been calling the crucial phase of accelerating change, that you're never quite sure where you are in the process of change because people are catching up all the time.
Well, I think it's very interesting because if you look at even the most basic of social groups, and you look at groups of people who live relatively sparsely in population zones, I'm thinking of that notional idyllic kind of rural habitation where you have one farm every couple of miles. Of course, those people are going to have one mindset as compared to people who are living cheek to jowl in big cities, who see different people every day and interact with hundreds of people every day. And then add to that all of the social media capabilities that exist today, and there's really no comparison. So there's no wonder that the political tendencies of both groups are often diametrically opposed from each other.
Yeah, and it's probably not generally recognized that it's cities that are driving globalization, because the cities that are all interconnected, which is what is making cities grow, and the people who are outside the cities are not so connected, and so they're not so interested in globalization, and they think that the change that is occurring in their neighborhoods is the fault of the cities, and therefore they vote against it. So, and I think this is going on absolutely everywhere. I think you can find evidence of it in China as well as in Japan, as well as in Europe, and certainly, I mean, Europe is certainly undergoing this process of accelerating change and trying very hard to cope with it. And then England leaving, which is one of the three major economies of Europe, and nobody's quite sure what the result of that is going to be. And so, of course, they look for something to put the blame on, and the blame is generally globalization.
Well, that's exactly what's happening here in this presidential election, as we've often discussed.
Yeah. So it's going to be interesting to see how this develops in the next, 3.5 months now?
I think it's down to 10 weeks, 10 weeks and 3 days.
10 weeks and 3 days.
Yeah. It's coming sooner than you think. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, part of it, I mean, I'm watching Hillary Clinton. She's just finishing a speech now in Reno, Nevada, in which she has tied Donald Trump to the alt-right wing of the Republican Party, which is a code name for neo-Nazism, kind of white supremacist kind of thinking. And she just released an ad about an hour ago, a 1-minute ad, complete with Ku Klux Klan members in uniform, David Duke, the whole 9 yards, wondering why Trump is associated with these people. And again, I mean, if there's one group or force that I could think of in the United States that is absolutely unalterably opposed to globalization, it's this neo-Nazi kind of white supremacist group, which I suspect tends to view globalization as an invasion of racial mongrels coming into the United States, diluting the pure Aryan pool and all this stuff that they go off with. But she gave a very effective speech. I had the volume up.
Huh. No, I mean, one of the strangest things about the primary season is that this, after all, is a country of immigration, and globalization is increasing immigration, but this country is against immigration.
It's mind-boggling, which is why Trump is desperately trying to reverse his course now and soften his immigration plan.
Yeah.
So, but again, the same tendency happens in Europe, as we've seen. It happened as part of Nigel Farage's campaign with that awful commercial of the hordes of people which look like Holocaust trains coming into England.
Yeah. The other thing that's going on in England is this revolt against the privatized train industry.
I've seen that. that.
And I'm not sure whether it's privatization in general or just complaints about the trains. But I think that there is part of this process of accelerating change and reorganization that comes with it is making it very difficult for people who are stuck with the old argument between the government controlling everything and everything being private. Because obviously things need to be organized on a larger and larger scale all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And yet you don't want corporations organizing things on a larger and larger scale. But if you're against the government organizing things, then you've got a problem.
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, I think what's happening with Britain in particular, that might be a little bit of a one-off case insofar as Western Europe is concerned, because I think a lot of this is still a bit of a hangover from Margaret Thatcher's time of intense privatization. And I have no firsthand experience of being on British trains, but I know a number of people who do, who tell me that the service is relatively poor.
Yeah.
Especially in comparison to the continent. The trains on the continent, which are subsidized, if not run outright by the governments, apparently run like proverbial Swiss watches in most cases, whereas the British train system is not so good.
Yeah.
So, and what's occurred now, I think people such as Richard Branson, I mean, there's a Virgin train system, in England. In addition to everything else he's involved in, he's also involved in the trains. So he watches this very closely. And I think his point of view is that, all right, look, if you've privatized this, if you've gone ahead and done this, I mean, that's the law. So everybody needs to have a fair shot at it, which means that I, too, am eligible to be treated fairly. So he's been one of the bigger noisemakers in what's been going on over there right now. And he's listened to for good reason.
Huh.
So he's very popular there for a number of reasons.
Well, I mean, trains are very much in the news at the moment because they're trying to do things with trains in this country. They're doing things with trains in Japan. They've got all these problems with trains in England. And as far as I know, the best place in the world to ride trains is in Europe, as long as they don't run into each other.
Yeah, they have a nasty habit of head-on collisions there, don't they? Yeah, periodically. But the biggest builder of trains in the world today is in fact China,
Yeah.
which is building train tracks
Yeah.
by the minute.
Especially what's the term they use now for the extra fast trains, and of course they're building trains in Africa as well.
They are.
After a period when all transportation was being transferred to the air, it seems as though it's coming back to earth.
Well, it's I think very economical in some respects. Plus, it also is definitely a trade follows the flag kind of thing. I mean, if you have actual physical railroad track laid down and the infrastructure to support that with corresponding train terminals and depots and all the rail freight accoutrements that have to come with it, that's a very good thing. And the Chinese are desperately trying to do that in the western part of their country to strengthen Beijing's role out there. I mean, you can take a train right now from Beijing to Tibet.
And you can take a train from Beijing to Tehran.
Oh, really?
In fact, from Shanghai to Tehran.
Isn't that something?
And very soon you'll be able to take one from Shanghai to London.
That's Kaiser Wilhelm's old dream, isn't it? Wasn't that one of his dreams in the pre-World War I, building a train system from Germany into the Near East? I think it was. I think it was. That's very interesting.
But the thing, and I forget now how long the first train that arrived in Tehran from Shanghai, how long it took. It was a few months ago now that it arrived, but I think they've already reduced the amount of time it takes.
Wow.
However, the problem seems to me is that you need a lot of infrastructure to run a train service. You need no infrastructure hardly to run an air service.
That's correct. That's correct.
And another of the big problems in this globalizing world is who's responsible for the infrastructure. And a country like India is having terrible problems with infrastructure. It's done hardly anything for its infrastructure since it became independent. China is focusing on infrastructure and seems to be doing very well with it, but obviously China has a very special form of government. Democracies aren't doing so well.
No, they're not. They're not. But I think what's going to happen is that the tipping point, I think, has been realized even by people who normally wouldn't pick up on this, is that the infrastructure state is such now that it's recognized something has to be done. And it may be that once the interest rates begin to tick up and investment in government bonds become attractive again, that the money will be there to permit these types of endeavors. That's my hope anyway. I mean, you can't overlook the negative effects of this quantitative easing on a global scale, right? You can't, the governments really can't borrow money because there are no buyers. I mean, who's going to invest in a negative bond? Who's going to buy a bond at the 25 basis point spread for 5 years? So it's difficult to raise money to embark on these kind of capital projects. But that will have to end. There's simply too much money that's been borrowed for this not to end without inflation coming.
But again, since we started with urbanization, and to get back to urbanization, I think that the infrastructure problem is increasing with increasing urbanization because everything has to be provided, and the connections between the cities. Everything is much more dependent upon infrastructure than life in the past has been.
Well, you can't have these mega cities without having a way to feed the people and bring the goods in for them to buy and consume. You're correct.
Yeah. And it's not just the well-established cities in the Western world, but cities like Karachi, which is one of the mega cities of the outside the Western world, which is having serious problems of infrastructure. Once again, I think China is doing better than most other countries in this regard.
I think without doubt, and it's that peculiar form of government that you alluded to that allows them to do it.
Yeah.
They can essentially sit in Beijing and will it, and then it will happen. I mean, I'm sure there are a number of world leaders who are quite envious of the situation.
Well, it's especially interesting to see this now because of what seems to be happening to Western democracy at the moment. Doesn't seem to be adapting very well to the changes in the way political voice is being determining what happens on the political scene.
Well, it doesn't seem to be getting any better. So, well, all right. Well, thank you then, Brian. We'll I guess end on that note, and we'll look forward to discussing next week. And good luck to you on your new academic year that begins next week.
Good. Thank you. See you in
All right.
September.
Thank you. All right.